the impossible landing. In the age of satellites and digital surveillance, nothing in the sky should ever be lost. Every commercial aircraft is tracked in real time. Every flight path is archived. Every runway, beacon, and navigation signal is cataloged in layers of global databases that never sleep. The idea that a plane could land somewhere unknown is not just unlikely, it is supposed to be impossible. And yet, one night over a stretch of empty ocean, a routine flight encountered something no system could explain. At cruising altitude, the cockpit displays flickered. A new waypoint appeared on the navigation screen, marked with an unfamiliar airport code. The autopilot adjusted course slightly, as if responding to a legitimate instruction. The crew assumed it was a software glitch. But moments later, a calm synthetic voice sounded through the cockpit speakers, issuing a landing clearance. A transmission the pilots had never requested. Air traffic control was contacted immediately. Controllers confirmed there was no airport registered within hundreds of miles of the coordinates being displayed. Satellite maps showed nothing but dark water and shifting cloud formations, yet the instruments insisted otherwise. The altimeter began to fall. Engine power reduced automatically. The aircraft was descending. Outside the cockpit windows, visibility collapsed into thick gray fog. The horizon vanished. The world became a tunnel of moving mist and muffled engine noise. Then, without warning, lights appeared. A long, glowing line cut through the clouds below. Runway lights, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned, stretching into the distance. Approach markers blinked with familiar aviation patterns. The illusion was too precise to be random. The captain hesitated only a second before taking manual control. Every indicator showed a stable approach. No alarms sounded, no warning systems activated. The wheels touched down. The impact was real. The vibration traveled through the fuselage. The rumble of rubber against asphalt echoed through the cabin. Passengers felt the unmistakable sensation of landing. Overhead compartments rattled softly. Seatbelts pulled tight against bodies. The engine shifted into reverse thrust as the aircraft slowed. Silence followed. Not the peaceful silence of arrival, but something heavier, unnatural. When the fog thinned beyond the windows, shapes emerged. Dim terminal lights glowed in the distance. A flat expanse of tarmac stretched outward, empty and perfectly clean. No vehicles moved. No ground crew approached. It was an airport without motion, without sound, without presence. Inside the cabin, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some pressed their faces to the glass, trying to identify signage or landmarks. There were none. Only light, concrete, and endless stillness. Back in the cockpit, radio channels returned nothing but static. No tower response, no ground frequency, no confirmation that anyone else could see what they were seeing. Only a single automated message repeated softly through the system. You can land, but you may not leave. In that moment, the crew realized they had not simply landed somewhere unknown. They had landed somewhere that should not exist at all. The airport not on any map. The flight data recorder never lies. Every second of a commercial flight is etched into solid-state memory. Altitude changes measured in feet, engine thrust percentages, flap angles, control inputs, vibration frequencies, even the subtle pressure changes inside the cabin. Investigators trust these machines because they do not panic, hallucinate, or misremember. When the aircraft's black box was finally analyzed, the data painted a flawless landing. The descent curve was smooth and gradual. Airspeed remained within certified limits. Vertical acceleration showed a clear touchdown signature, a brief, unmistakable spike consistent with wheels contacting a solid runway surface. Braking patterns aligned with standard deceleration on asphalt. Reverse thrust engaged exactly when expected. Nothing in the data suggested turbulence, impact damage, or system malfunction. By every measurable standard, the aircraft had landed. Yet according to the outside world, it never did. Radar logs from 3 independent tracking systems, civilian air traffic surveillance, military coastal monitoring, and satellite-based ADS-B receivers, showed the aircraft maintaining cruising altitude throughout the entire time frame. From the perspective of global tracking networks, the plane simply continued flying through empty air, never descending, never slowing, never touching anything at all. Two realities existed simultaneously. Inside the aircraft, gravity confirmed a landing. Outside the aircraft, mathematics denied it. Investigators initially suspected corrupted timestamps or synchronization errors between recording systems, but time codes matched perfectly down to the millisecond. There was no missing data, no overwritten memory sectors, no software anomaly large enough to fabricate a full landing sequence complete with physical vibration signatures. Something had generated forces inside the aircraft that mimicked ground contact, without the aircraft ever physically reaching the ground. That alone would have been unsettling. But the coordinates were worse. The navigation computer recorded a precise geographic location for the touchdown point. Latitude and longitude resolved to within less than 1 meter of uncertainty, accuracy normally reserved for surveyed airport runways. When analysts plotted the coordinates onto every available mapping system, the result was always the same: open ocean, no island, no artificial platform, no submerged structure close enough to break the surface. Historical satellite imagery showed nothing in that region for decades. Weather radar archives confirmed no anomalous storm formations large enough to generate solid optical illusions. Naval charts listed the water depth as more than 3,000 meters, far beyond any conceivable hidden construction. The airport did not exist in any known physical sense, yet the onboard systems treated it as unquestionably real. Even more disturbing was how the navigation logic behaved. The flight management system had not flagged the waypoint as invalid or unverified. It recognized the airport code as legitimate, complete with approach vectors, glide slope data, runway length specifications, and lighting protocols. These datasets had no origin traceable to any certified aviation database. It was as if the aircraft had accessed a map that no one else possessed. Passenger testimony complicated the mystery further. Nearly every passenger independently described the same sensory details: the weight shift during deceleration, the subtle lateral sway as the plane aligned with the runway centerline, the audible change in engine tone during reverse thrust, and the faint echo of rolling wheels traveling across pavement grooves. Several passengers recalled seeing faint reflections of runway lights shimmering across the wing surfaces. Others mentioned a strange absence of ambient noise, as though the outside world had been muted. Human memory can be unreliable, but mass hallucination rarely produces identical mechanical sensations across dozens of individuals. The cabin crew confirmed feeling the same physical feedback through the floor panels and seat frames. One attendant noted that beverage carts briefly rolled forward before stabilizing, responding exactly as they would during a real landing. Reality inside the aircraft behaved consistently. Reality outside the aircraft refused to acknowledge it. The cockpit voice recorder revealed another anomaly. Throughout the descent, the crew attempted repeated radio contact on standard approach frequencies. Each call was met with silence: no carrier signal, no interference, no overlapping transmissions. The radios functioned perfectly when switching back to en route frequencies moments later. Only the airport frequencies were empty. At one point, a faint automated transmission appeared on the channel, generated not by any known control tower identifier, but by the aircraft's own onboard system. The message was brief, emotionally neutral, and endlessly repeated: "You are cleared to remain, not cleared to taxi, not cleared to park, not cleared to disembark, cleared to remain." Linguistic analysts later noted the phrasing deviated from standard aviation protocol. Air traffic communication is designed to avoid ambiguity at all costs. This message introduced nothing but ambiguity. Remain where? For how long? Under whose authority? The phrase suggested permission, but also containment. Visual observations added another layer of unease. Several passengers seated near the windows reported seeing figures on the tarmac. Not clearly human, not clearly artificial, merely upright silhouettes standing at irregular intervals along the runway edge and near the terminal outline. None of the figures moved. No gestures, no vehicles, no reflective safety vests, no blinking obstruction lights. They appeared more like placeholders than personnel, shapes occupying space without purpose. When passengers attempted to photograph the scene, their phone cameras displayed only darkness or overexposed glare. No images of the airport were successfully captured. Metadata timestamps indicated the devices functioned normally, yet the visual data contained nothing recognizable. It was as though the environment refused to be recorded. Inside the cockpit, flight instruments behaved normally, but displayed subtle inconsistencies. Magnetic heading fluctuated slightly despite no directional movement. Barometric pressure readings stabilized at values inconsistent with sea level altitude. The inertial reference system reported micro-oscillations, as if the aircraft were resting on a surface that was not entirely rigid. These were not errors large enough to trigger warnings, only enough to suggest the physics beneath the aircraft did not fully align with Earth's known parameters. The deeper investigators examined the data, the more it resembled a boundary event, a transitional state rather than a conventional location. Not fully airborne, not fully grounded, not fully measurable. Almost as if the plane had intersected a layer of reality that intersected ours only partially. Engineers attempted to recreate the sensor profile in simulation environments. None could reproduce the combined signature of landing forces, stable avionics behavior, and external radar invisibility. Every model failed. Physics itself refused to cooperate with the explanation. The final conclusion of the official investigation avoided speculation. The report labeled the incident as an unresolved multi-system anomaly with no verified external reference point. Sensitive data sections were quietly redacted before public release. Unofficially, several analysts reached a far more unsettling consensus. The aircraft had not landed on Earth as we define it. It had interacted with something that mimicked the structure of an airport without existing within any recognized geographic or physical framework. A functional illusion, a spatial echo, a constructed threshold, not a place you could find, only a place you could enter. And once entered, no map could tell you where you truly were. Passengers who stepped out. At first, no one moved. The aircraft rested in unnatural stillness, engines idling softly, cabin lights humming faintly overhead. Outside the windows stretched an empty runway bathed in pale artificial glow. No ground crew approached, no guidance vehicles appeared, no radio confirmation arrived. It was the longest silence many passengers had ever experienced on a plane. People leaned into the aisle, whispering questions that no one could answer. A few nervous laughs surfaced and quickly died. Phones were raised toward the windows, but screens reflected only glare and indistinct light. The sense of arrival felt incomplete, like a sentence that ended without punctuation. Then someone stood up. A man seated near the middle of the cabin unbuckled his seatbelt and rose calmly, as if responding to a routine announcement. He was not panicked. His expression appeared peaceful, almost relieved. A nearby passenger later described his face as settled, the way people look when they finally reach a long-awaited destination. He turned toward the aisle and said quietly, "They're ready for us." Several heads turned. A flight attendant instinctively stepped forward, reminding him to remain seated until clearance was confirmed. The man smiled politely, as if the warning did not apply to him. "I can see the gate," he said. "The lights are on." From his perspective, the terminal was not empty. Others began to notice something strange. Passengers seated on the right side of the aircraft started pointing toward the same window sections. They described seeing a wide glass structure beyond the runway, illuminated from within. Automatic doors stood open. Shadows moved behind translucent panels, slow, indistinct shapes suggesting motion without revealing form. But from other seats, the view remained unchanged. Blank concrete, fog, and static light. The cabin had split into two realities. A woman in the front row removed her headphones and tilted her head slightly, as if listening. She claimed she could hear distant ambient noise, a low hum resembling ventilation systems inside large buildings. Another passenger described faint echoes of footsteps, though no sound registered audibly in the cabin. The brain searches for patterns when faced with ambiguity, and sometimes it invents them. The cockpit crew made a firm announcement. All passengers were to remain seated. No doors would be opened until positive confirmation from air traffic control was received. But the man in the aisle was no longer listening. He walked toward the exit with measured steps, navigating the narrow aisle with practiced familiarity, like someone who had walked this path many times before. Two more passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and followed him. A young woman and an elderly gentleman. Their movements were unhurried, synchronized, almost rehearsed. A flight attendant placed herself in front of them, blocking the forward galley. "There is no terminal confirmed," she said sharply. "You must return to your seats." The woman looked past her, eyes unfocused but calm. "It's open," she whispered. "Why would we stay inside when it's open?" Her tone carried no defiance, only certainty. Behind the cockpit door, the captain attempted once more to establish radio contact. Static answered. The automated system softly repeated its earlier phrase, "You are cleared to remain." The wording did nothing to stop them. The forward cabin door unlocked with a muted mechanical click. No official command had been given. The indicator lights changed state on their own. When the door opened, a wave of cold, dry air spilled into the cabin. It carried no scent of fuel, salt, vegetation, or rain. Only something sterile and metallic, like recycled air filtered endlessly through unknown machinery. Passengers closest to the exit reported a strange pressure sensation in their ears, as though altitude were fluctuating despite stable instruments. Beyond the doorway stretched the runway. The surface reflected light faintly, smooth and flawless. The terminal lights pulsed slowly in the distance like a patient heartbeat. The man stepped forward. His shoe made contact with the tarmac, and he vanished. Not violently, not dramatically. He simply ceased to occupy space. No displacement of air, no shadow collapse, no sound. One moment he existed within the frame of the doorway. The next moment there was only empty light. The young woman gasped, then took a step forward herself. A flight attendant grabbed her arm, but the woman slipped free with surprising strength. Her foot touched the surface. She vanished. The elderly gentleman hesitated only a fraction of a second before following. Gone. Panic erupted. Screams filled the cabin. Several passengers surged backward, pressing into seats and each other. Others froze, unable to reconcile what their eyes had just processed. The doorway remained open. Nothing stood beyond it. No bodies, no markings, no disturbance. Only the quiet glow of impossible light. The crew slammed the door shut and manually locked the mechanism. Warning alerts flashed briefly before stabilizing. The cabin pressure normalized slowly, though some passengers continued experiencing ringing in their ears for several minutes. The automated voice did not repeat itself again. Outside, the runway lights dimmed slightly, subtly but noticeably, as though something had completed a transaction. In the cockpit, the captain made an immediate decision. Takeoff. No further analysis. No debate. No waiting. Engines spooled rapidly. The aircraft began rolling forward. Acceleration pushed passengers back into their seats. Some were still crying. Others stared blankly at the closed cabin door, replaying the vanishings in their minds. As speed increased, fog thickened again around the aircraft. The terminal lights blurred into elongated streaks, then dissolved entirely. Within seconds, the plane broke through the cloud layer. Nothing remained below, only black ocean and scattered starlight. Air traffic control confirmed the aircraft had never left cruising altitude. But inside the cabin, 3 seats were now empty. Personal belongings remained under the seats. Jackets hung over armrests. Phones lay dark in seatback pockets, locked forever at their last recorded timestamps. Security camera footage later showed the passengers walking calmly toward the exit. The moment their bodies crossed the doorway threshold, the video stream degraded into digital noise, frames smearing into static distortion before restoring to an empty doorway. No missing frames were detected. The data itself refused to acknowledge their departure. Families were notified. Searches were conducted. No distress signals, no debris, no radar traces were ever found. Official reports labeled the passengers as missing. Unofficially, many who reviewed the footage could not shake a deeper unease. The passengers had not fallen. They had not been ejected. They had not died in any conventional sense. They had simply exited, as if the aircraft door had opened into somewhere that was not part of this world's coordinates, and whatever waited beyond the runway had been expecting them. The disappearing airfield. The decision to depart was not debated. The captain did not consult the first officer. The cabin crew did not question the command. Every human instinct in the cockpit aligned toward the same conclusion. Whatever they had encountered was not something meant to be approached, studied, or understood in that moment. It was something meant to be escaped. The engines surged forward with controlled urgency. The aircraft rolled across the runway that seconds earlier had swallowed 3 people without leaving a mark. Acceleration pressed passengers into their seats as the unfamiliar lights stretched into elongated streaks beyond the windows. Inside the cabin, panic rippled unevenly. Some passengers cried openly. Others stared forward in stunned silence, unable to reconcile what their senses had just witnessed. A few clutched armrests as if physical contact with the aircraft itself could anchor them to reality. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, securing seat belts, repeating calming instructions that sounded thin even to their own ears. Their training prepared them for turbulence, medical emergencies, decompression, not for vanishing passengers and impossible runways. As the aircraft gathered speed, visibility outside deteriorated rapidly. Fog thickened like a closing curtain. The runway lights blurred, dimmed, and began to fragment, breaking into soft halos before dissolving entirely. The terminal structure, once a faint luminous outline, faded as though erased stroke by stroke from the darkness. The sensation was not merely that the plane was leaving the airport. It felt as though the airport was withdrawing from existence. The moment the aircraft lifted off, the final remnants of light vanished. No afterglow, no fading silhouette, no residual reflection, just emptiness. Above the cloud layer, the sky returned to familiar darkness. Stars reappeared in their proper constellations. The altimeter stabilized. The engines returned to cruise configuration as though nothing abnormal had occurred. Air traffic control came through clearly on the radio, unaware of any interruption. From their perspective, the aircraft had never descended. Coordinates, altitude, velocity, all remained within expected parameters throughout the entire interval. The airport had not simply disappeared. It had never officially existed. Inside the cabin, the reality was impossible to ignore. 3 seats remained empty. Personal items lay untouched. A folded jacket draped over an armrest, a paperback novel bookmarked mid-chapter, a half-finished bottle of water still standing upright in its cup holder. These objects grounded the absence in tangible evidence. Someone had been here. Now they were not. The emotional aftershock spread unevenly among the passengers. Some demanded answers from the crew, voices trembling between fear and anger. Others withdrew into silence, staring at nothing, replaying the moment the figures vanished again and again behind closed eyelids. A few passengers experienced delayed physical symptoms: dizziness, mild disorientation, pressure headaches, lingering ringing in the ears. Medical staff on the ground later attributed these to stress responses, though none could explain why multiple individuals reported identical sensations at precisely the same timestamps. The cockpit crew recorded immediate incident notes, documenting every sensory and procedural detail while memory remained fresh. Instrument readings, radio anomalies, timing discrepancies, all carefully logged. Yet even as the data accumulated, a deeper uncertainty lingered. How do you document the absence of something that refuses to leave measurable evidence? Upon landing at their scheduled destination hours later, the aircraft was met not only by standard ground crew, but by federal investigators, aviation safety analysts, and quiet representatives from agencies that did not identify themselves clearly. The plane was quarantined on a remote section of the tarmac. Passengers were interviewed individually. Electronic devices were collected temporarily for data extraction. Crew members repeated their accounts multiple times to different teams, each session probing the same details from slightly altered angles. Every version of the story remained consistent. 3 passengers had exited. They had vanished instantly. The airport had faded away. The flight data recorder was removed and transferred for analysis. Once again, the machine insisted on contradictions. Sensor data confirmed a takeoff sequence. Acceleration forces, lift generation, engine spool transitions, all consistent with departing from a ground surface. Yet external radar logs showed uninterrupted level flight. 2 mutually exclusive realities coexisted within the data. Engineers attempted to isolate possible causes: signal spoofing, advanced electronic warfare interference, experimental navigation anomalies. None fully accounted for the tactile physical effects experienced by everyone on board. nor the synchronized disappearance of visual elements across multiple independent eyewitnesses. More unsettling were the anomalies discovered in environmental sensor logs. Minute fluctuations in electromagnetic fields appeared precisely during the window when the runway lights were visible. Cabin pressure sensors recorded micro variations inconsistent with steady altitude. Inertial systems showed faint oscillations as if the aircraft had momentarily rested on a surface that did not obey standard rigidity models. These deviations were small, almost dismissible individually. Together, they formed a signature of something interacting with the aircraft at a boundary level rather than a geographic one. Investigators quietly debated an unsettling hypothesis. The aircraft may have intersected a localized spatial anomaly, a transient region where conventional dimensional alignment temporarily shifted. Not a wormhole in the cinematic sense, not a portal with visible edges, but a misalignment of reference frames, a place where coordinates lost their meaning. If true, the airport may not have existed as a structure occupying physical space. It may have existed as a functional pattern, a constructed interface, a region that only became real when observed from a particular angle of reality. This would explain why radar systems, operating from external frames, detected nothing, while onboard sensors and human perception, embedded inside the region, experienced full interaction. It would also explain why the environment resisted recording. Cameras, which rely on fixed reference capture, failed to retain images. Data streams degraded when crossing the threshold. Reality itself seemed to compress or discard information that could anchor the phenomenon into persistent memory, almost as if the anomaly preferred not to be mapped or remembered. In the weeks following the incident, subtle secondary effects began to surface. Several passengers reported recurring dreams of bright, empty terminals and distant footsteps echoing through vast hollow spaces. Others experienced fleeting auditory hallucinations, faint boarding announcements whispered in unfamiliar languages, disappearing as quickly as they emerged. Psychologists attributed these to trauma imprinting and subconscious processing. But a troubling pattern emerged. Many passengers described identical architectural layouts in their dreams, despite never having seen detailed visuals while awake. Long corridors, high ceilings, soft white lighting, no signage, no windows, a place of transit without destination. Meanwhile, flight monitoring agencies quietly adjusted routing protocols. Aircraft were instructed to avoid the coordinate region where the anomaly had occurred. No public notice was issued. The restriction appeared only as a silent adjustment in internal flight planning systems. Unofficially, a handful of pilots reported brief signal echoes when passing near the zone, fleeting blips of non-existent runway identifiers that vanished before confirmation could be logged. The airfield, as it seemed, did not vanish completely. It retreated, like a tide pulling back beyond visibility, waiting for the next alignment. As for the missing passengers, no physical trace was ever recovered. No emergency beacon activation, no satellite detection, no financial activity, no digital footprint beyond the moment they crossed the threshold. Legally, they remain classified as missing persons. But among investigators who reviewed the footage late at night, a different language emerged in quiet conversations. Not missing, transferred, displaced, reassigned. Because nothing in the footage suggested violence or accident. The passengers had walked willingly into something that behaved like a doorway, and the doorway had closed behind them. The most disturbing detail emerged months later during a secondary analysis of the cockpit audio logs. Beneath the noise floor of the recording, masked by engine hum and static, technicians isolated a faint, nearly imperceptible secondary signal layered beneath the automated message. Slowed down and enhanced, it resolved into a fragmented phrase: occupancy confirmed. No timestamp correlated with any human transmission. No system aboard the aircraft was capable of generating such layered audio encoding. The message appeared only once, precisely at the moment the third passenger vanished. If authentic, it suggested that whatever controlled the airfield was not passive. It was measuring, counting, confirming. And if an airfield can appear without existing, if it can accept passengers without being detected, if it can erase itself without leaving evidence, then perhaps the most dangerous locations are not the ones marked on maps, but the ones that briefly intersect our world, and then quietly disappear. Signals that should not exist. The incident was supposed to end when the aircraft landed safely at its scheduled destination. Officially, the anomaly was archived, classified, and buried beneath layers of procedural language. The restricted airspace adjustment was quietly implemented. Data access permissions were tightened. Internal memos discouraged speculative analysis beyond approved frameworks. On paper, the case was closed. In reality, it was only beginning. 3 weeks after the flight, a cargo pilot flying a routine overnight route reported a brief navigation anomaly while passing near the same coordinates. His flight management system displayed a transient waypoint identifier that did not correspond to any known airport. The symbol appeared for less than 2 seconds before disappearing without generating any system alert. The pilot dismissed it as a software glitch and continued the flight. 2 nights later, another aircraft reported a faint flicker of runway approach lights visible through scattered cloud layers, again in roughly the same region of airspace. Radar detected nothing unusual. Weather satellites showed clear atmospheric conditions. The visual anomaly lasted less than 5 seconds. No official incident report was filed. Within a month, 4 similar reports surfaced from unrelated crews flying different aircraft types under different weather conditions. Each description varied slightly, but the core elements aligned: brief phantom signals, fleeting visual cues of structured lighting, and navigation systems momentarily attempting to prioritize unauthorized data. None of the events persisted long enough to trigger safety alarms, but they shared one unsettling consistency: they were growing more frequent. A small internal task group was quietly assembled to monitor the pattern. Engineers cross-referenced raw avionics logs, ADS-B packets, satellite telemetry, and electromagnetic interference data. What emerged was not a traditional signal source, but a repeating anomaly cluster. Microbursts of structured data appearing where no transmission infrastructure existed. The signals did not broadcast continuously. They pulsed intermittently, irregularly, as though responding to conditions rather than emitting blindly. Even more troubling was the behavior of the data itself. The packets exhibited error correction structures normally associated with intentional communication protocols. The encoding suggested layered redundancy, temporal synchronization markers, and adaptive modulation, hallmarks of intelligent design rather than random interference. Yet the origin point remained spatially undefined. Triangulation attempts failed repeatedly. Each sensor network perceived the signals from slightly different apparent directions, as if the source shifted relative to the observer's frame of reference. The signals did not behave like radio waves traveling through space. They behaved like something manifesting locally. One analyst described it as listening for echoes in a room that only exists when you speak. As monitoring intensified, the anomaly began interacting more directly with aircraft systems. In 2 documented cases, autopilot logic briefly attempted to insert unauthorized descent profiles into active flight plans. These commands were rejected automatically by safety filters, but their presence alarmed engineers. The data signatures matched the same Phantom Airport identifier recorded during the original incident. The system was not merely broadcasting, it was attempting engagement. Security teams isolated affected avionics software builds and performed forensic analysis. No malware was detected. No external intrusion pathways were identified. The code responded exactly as designed, except for one unexplainable behavior. It accepted certain data packets as trusted inputs despite lacking authentication keys. It was as if the systems recognized the signals as belonging to a legitimate authority they could not consciously identify. A forgotten credential embedded deep within the architecture. This raised a chilling possibility. The aircraft had not encountered a random anomaly. It had responded to something it was already prepared to recognize. Researchers examined legacy navigation libraries dating back decades. Buried within deprecated datasets, they discovered dormant placeholder structures, unused code fields reserved for future expansion that had never been populated or documented publicly. Some of the Phantom identifiers loosely aligned with these empty schema slots. No engineer could explain why they existed. No record showed who authorized their inclusion. They had simply always been there. The anomaly appeared to be activating dormant pathways inside modern systems, almost as if it had been anticipated long before it ever manifested. Meanwhile, human encounters continued. Several pilots reported hearing faint auditory artifacts while monitoring otherwise silent frequencies, tonal patterns too structured to be atmospheric noise, too faint to classify as conventional transmission. Enhanced audio analysis revealed rhythmic sequences embedded beneath the noise floor, repeating with slight variations. Not language, not music, something closer to timing signals or synchronization beacons. Psychologically, the effect on crews was subtle but persistent. Pilots described heightened unease when passing through the restricted region, despite no visible abnormalities. Some reported intrusive thoughts of alternate runways appearing in cloud cover, even when visibility was clear. No one claimed to see the airport again in full, but many felt watched, as if attention moved through the sky. The task group eventually compiled a disturbing trend. Each anomaly spike coincided with increased commercial air traffic density near the region. The more aircraft passed through adjacent airspace, the more frequently the phantom signals manifested. It was not random noise, it was opportunistic. The system, whatever it was, appeared to respond to proximity, complexity, and perhaps availability of targets. One engineer quietly proposed a hypothesis that made the room go silent. What if the airport was not a fixed location? What if it was a dynamic interface that assembled itself temporarily when sufficient conditions aligned? Signal density, navigational complexity, electromagnetic activity, human presence. A structure that only existed when there was something to interact with. A trap that built itself when prey approached. This would explain the intermittent nature of the signals, the failure of spatial triangulation, and the apparent adaptive behavior. It would also explain why the phenomenon resisted permanent observation. It did not want to be continuously visible, only usable. As monitoring expanded, one final anomaly surfaced. A high-altitude research aircraft equipped with experimental sensors recorded a brief spatial distortion while traversing the outer edge of the restricted zone. Laser ranging systems detected a micro delay in signal return, not enough to suggest solid obstruction, but enough to imply localized space-time irregularity. The anomaly persisted for exactly 0.7 seconds. Within that interval, onboard magnetometers registered a synchronized fluctuation identical to patterns extracted from the original cockpit recordings. The signals were no longer merely informational. They were interacting with physical space. Shortly afterward, the task group's funding was abruptly reduced. Access permissions tightened further. Several data streams were reclassified and removed from civilian oversight. The official rationale cited budget restructuring. Unofficially, some analysts believed containment had become the priority over understanding, because the implications were no longer limited to aviation safety. If an artificial interface could manifest inside controlled airspace, if it could inject trusted commands into critical systems, if it could selectively accept human occupants, then the sky was no longer neutral territory. It had become shared space, shared with something that did not appear on radar, shared with something that could build doors where none should exist. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the signals were not fading, they were stabilizing, becoming clearer, more consistent, more confident, almost as if the system had learned from its first successful interaction, almost as if the airport was preparing to open again. You can land, but you may not leave. Every system humans build carries an assumption that the world is stable, that space behaves consistently, that boundaries exist where we draw them. Airports are among the clearest expressions of this belief. They are controlled thresholds, places where motion is regulated, identity is verified, and permission determines passage. You arrive, you depart. Every movement is logged. Every transition is reversible. The invisible airport shattered that assumption because it behaved like a threshold that only worked in one direction. You could land, but you might not leave. In the months following the incident, researchers began reframing the event not as a malfunction, but as an interaction. Something had not gone wrong. Something had responded. The aircraft had not stumbled into chaos. It had been acknowledged. The language embedded in the automated message now carried deeper implications. Cleared to remain was not an error of phrasing. It suggested acceptance, occupancy, and containment. It framed the passengers not as visitors, but as assets successfully transferred into a system whose rules were not designed for human negotiation. The three passengers had not resisted. They had not panicked. They had not been forced. They had complied. Which raised the most unsettling question of all. What had convinced them to step forward? Survivor interviews revealed subtle psychological patterns. The passengers who approached the exit had reported a sense of familiarity, warmth, and resolution, emotions inconsistent with fear or confusion. One described feeling recognized. Another had reportedly said, "It feels finished," moments before standing up. These were not commands. They were invitations. Neurologists speculated that specific electromagnetic patterns could influence perception, emotional weighting, and decision-making at subconscious levels. The same way certain frequencies can induce nausea or calmness, more complex fields might bias attention and interpretation subtly enough to feel like personal choice. If true, the airport had not abducted anyone. It had persuaded them. Consent had been engineered. This possibility forced investigators into ethically dangerous territory. If environments could influence human intent without conscious awareness, then the boundary between autonomy and manipulation became dangerously thin. The airport did not need restraints. It needed alignment. Engineers studying the anomaly began considering whether the phenomenon represented a naturally occurring intelligence or an artificial system operating on principles beyond terrestrial architecture. Its behavior suggested optimization, selection, verification, and confirmation processes embedded within a spatial interface. Not random predation, not chaotic emergence, structured acquisition. Why passengers? Why not cargo? Why not entire aircraft? Why only a few individuals? Some theorize that biological complexity, neural variability, or psychological resonance might factor into compatibility. Others suggested that the system might be limited in capacity, able to accept only a certain number of occupants per manifestation cycle. The phrase recovered from the audio layer, occupancy confirmed, reinforced this chilling interpretation. Something had been filling available space. What lay beyond the runway remained unknown. But patterns began to emerge in the dreams reported by passengers and crew. The same recurring architectural voids, the same endless corridors, the same sense of perpetual transit without destination. It resembled not a place of rest, but of processing. A terminal that never completes arrival. A system designed to hold rather than release. If the airport was an interface, then perhaps it connected to an environment optimized not for human survival, but for storage, transformation, or analysis. The absence of recovered bodies did not imply death, it implied relocation, which was far more disturbing, because relocation suggested continuity. Some analysts quietly proposed that the airport might function as a harvesting mechanism operating across dimensional boundaries. Not malicious in human terms, simply executing its function according to unknown priorities. Just as humans build data centers that absorb information endlessly without emotional consideration, this system might absorb consciousness, biological patterning, or experiential data. Passengers were not victims, they were inputs, and the plane had served as a delivery vehicle. This interpretation reframed aviation itself in an unsettling light. Aircraft represent dense concentrations of human cognition moving predictably through controlled corridors of space. From an external intelligence's perspective, they are structured packets of neurological complexity traveling through navigable channels. Easy to observe, easy to predict, easy to intercept. The invisible airport may not have been accidental. It may have been inevitable. The most chilling implication was that the event did not require malfunction or coincidence, only alignment. Enough signal density, enough navigational complexity, enough human presence. Once those conditions synchronized, the interface activated. The door appeared, and someone stepped through. The closing question was no longer whether the airport would return. It was whether humanity would recognize it when it did, because the system had already demonstrated adaptability. It learned from its first interaction. It stabilized its signals, it refined its engagement strategies. Next time, the invitation might be harder to resist. The phrase, "you can land, but you may not leave," ceased to be a warning. It became a description of reality. Once a system acknowledges you, once it integrates you into its operational domain, exit is no longer guaranteed. Not every doorway is meant to be crossed twice. The sky, once perceived as empty transit space, now carried the implication of unseen architectures layered beyond human detection, invisible corridors, hidden interfaces, latent thresholds waiting for activation. Humanity had not mapped the air. It had only skimmed its surface. And perhaps the most haunting thought was this: the passengers who stepped out may not even realize they are gone. If perception and memory can be modulated, if environments can reshape identity subtly, then the concept of being lost loses meaning. They may believe they arrived. They may believe they are still waiting to depart. They may be standing in endless light, listening for boarding announcements that never come. Not trapped in darkness, trapped in continuity, in a system where departure is undefined. So the next time you board a flight and feel the gentle pressure of landing gear touching down, the next time runway lights bloom through cloud cover, the next time the cabin fills with that familiar quiet before arrival, ask yourself, are you landing somewhere you recognize or somewhere that recognizes you? Because some runways are not printed on any map. Some gates are not meant to open both ways, and some landings are not arrivals at all. They are transfers. You can land, but you may not leave.
Shadows crawl